Alright, so this is a video key for the post-lab problem sets for week 7. Okay, so in this example here, the first thing that we'll look at are the goodness of fit test post-lab problems. And here we are looking at a species of bird, the California quail, in which the males have an exaggerated trait that has responded to selective pressure from sexual selection. So, in particular, the males have this head plume that you see here. Now, to test whether or not the female quails were selecting males based on the characteristics of this plume, a mate choice study was conducted. So, male California quails had the plume snipped off of their heads, and then a fake plume was glued on in its place. So half of the males got a replacement that's the same size as the mean of the original plumes, and the other half of the males got a plume that was 50% larger. So trials were conducted in which a female was placed at the center of this choice arena, and male 1 was over here, male 2 was over here. And one of these males has a regular plume, the other has an enlarged plume, and it would be randomized, of course, as to which male went into which side. And then choice, female choice, was recorded when the female entered either zone 1 as being a choice for male 1, or if the female entered into zone 2 as a choice for male 2. So we had a total of 50 trials that we're looking at here. And we're looking at male types, so we have normal plumed males were chosen 16 times, and big plumed males were chosen 34 times. So we now want to use this information to answer the following questions. So the first question here is simply looking at what the null hypothesis for this goodness of fit test would be. And remember that the null hypothesis is always the hypothesis of no difference. So here, the number of choices for each male matches the expectation if choice was random. This is your best choice here of your options. Okay. The next question that we have here is asking about the reference or expected relative frequency for the big plumed males. Okay, so we wanted the answer to be a fraction here, and we were talking about relative frequencies. And if we are expecting that choice is going to be random, this means that you're going to have equal amount of choice for each option. There are only 2 options, males with enlarged plumes or normal-sized plumes. So if choice is actually random, then 0.5 should be the expected relative frequency for the big plume males. 0.5 would also be the expected relative frequency for the normal size plumed males. All right, so the next question here is getting at what is the expected count for the big plumed males. Well, for this, you have to think about the fact that half is what you expect to be chosen for the big plumed males. And then you need to think back to the question here. We're told that a total of 50 trials are conducted. So 50% or half of 50 is 25. So this is where our expected count for the big plume males is coming from. Okay, so here we are, the next question, the absolute best approach to this goodness of fit question would be a binomial test, but because we're not focusing too much on the binomial test in here, we want to examine this with a chi-square goodness of fit test. So for this here, this is the first bit where you actually really need to get into R and do something to calculate this value. Okay, so if we bring up my R console here, I've already made sure that my working directory is where it needs to be, and we're going to be working on goodness of fit questions. Okay, so goodness of fit for the normal and the big plumed birds. And here I am simply entering the data that are already written there for you as part of the question, but this was the simplest way to get these data into R. And I'm defining a matrix here, the plume.data, and we are reading in this input that I have just typed in. And if we call up plume.data to see what this looks like, you'll notice that this looks exactly like the data table that I indicated for you in this question. Okay, so here we're going to store the plume results, and we're doing the chi-square test. We're doing chi-square test of plume.data, and we can also call this up here. So we have a chi-square test for given probabilities. We are looking at data, plume data. We have a chi-square value of 6.48, degree of freedom of 1, and a p-value of 0.01091. Okay. Notice that we did not specify what the expected probabilities were here. We didn't enter a value here, p equals, and specify what those values were. Okay. We didn't have to do that because in this case, we don't have to specify what those expected probabilities are because we're expecting equal frequencies. Okay? However, if you want to satisfy your curiosity, you can see if we call up a chi-square test and we specify those given probability values. Here we're saying p is equal to combine 0.5 and 0.5 because these are the probabilities that we would expect for the normal plumed and the big plumed males. You see that we get exactly the same results. Okay. So here our chi-square value is 6.48. So in our question here, 6.48 is that chi-square value. Okay. Here we are asking about the degrees of freedom. So assuming that this is a case with just one constraint on the data, which is typically the case, what is the degrees of freedom here? And you could calculate that out simply by reading the question. You can also look here at the results for your chi-square test, and you see a degree of freedom of 1. Okay, the next question here, it is asking you what the p-value for your chi-square test is to 3 decimal places. And if we look here, we have 0.01091, so rounding this to 3 decimal places, we have 0.011. Okay, so this is where our p-value is coming from here. And in the next question, I'm asking you to interpret these results. We are assuming a standard alpha significance level of 0.05. So in interpreting these results, we have a p-value of 0.011. 0.011 is less than 0.05. So this tells us that we should reject the null hypothesis that females are choosing equally. Because we are rejecting this null hypothesis, we know that there is a difference in the number of times females are choosing the big plumed versus the normal plumed males. And by simply looking at the numbers, because in this case we only have 2 choices here, normal plumed and big plumed, and we have a significant difference between them. Because 34 is larger than 16, we can pick the second choice here. Females are choosing big plumed males significantly more often than expected by chance. Okay. The second problem here, we are looking at data for deer. And so we're looking at a forest that has recently been partially burned and then going out and doing a census for deer population. So here we have deer using burned areas, there are edge areas, and then there are other areas of the forest. So when the census is done, 7 deer are seen in the burned areas, 21 on the edge areas, and 49 in the unaffected areas. So we have 3 different areas that we're looking at. And then we also have some values here getting at the actual area of these different classifications. So we see that the entire area covered by the census was 37,000 meters squared, a burned area, 28,600 square meters of edge, and 148,100 square meters of unaffected. So we want to do a chi-square test here to figure out if we can reject the hypothesis, the null hypothesis here, that the deer are randomly distributed among these three areas. Okay, so in order to do that, okay, here we want to work on our second problem. So we have to get these data into R in the first place. So here I'm defining column 1 as being 7, 21, and 49. That's 7 deer in burned areas, 21 in edge, and 49 in unaffected areas. The second column I'm defining as the areas. So we have 37,000 in the burned area, 28,600 in the edge area, and 148,100 in the unaffected area. And notice as I'm entering this as columns. Okay, and this 37,000, that's in the burned area, and that's in the same position, that first row, that the 7 deer that are in the burned areas are. Okay. If we then define column number 3 here, column number 3 is column 2 divided by the sum of column 2. So the sum of column 2 is going to be the total area. Okay, so what we are working on calculating here is the proportion of area that is occupied by each of these different classes, burned, edge, or unaffected. And then column 4, simply because I know reading through the questions, having written the questions, that I asked you about some of the expected numbers. So even though the chi-square test will calculate this out for us, I wanted to calculate this out as a separate column, looking at the expected numbers. So the reason why this works here, so column 4 is what this is saying. It's the sum of column 1. Remember, column 1, this is the total number of deer. It's the sum of column 1 times column 3. Column 3 was the proportion that each one of these types of land area is occupying. So that's how we get our expected numbers. Okay, and then I'm going to bind all of these columns together into a matrix called forest here. So forest is C-bind, which stands for column bind. And I'm binding columns 1, 2, 3, and 4. You don't have to call them call 1, call 2, call 3, call 4. This is simply what I chose to call them. Now here I'm going to define some column names, and I'm going to define some row names. And now I have my final table here. So this table, we have burned, edge, and unaffected areas. We've got our number of deer, the area of the forest, the number of deer and the area of the forest was given in the text of the question, and then we calculated out that proportion of area and the expected number of deer in each one of those if they were distributed randomly. Okay. If we enter this here, notice how we've entered forest, and then we've used the square brackets. We didn't enter a number in the row position. We just jumped straight to the comma 3. So what this means, because we didn't enter a number for rows, it means all rows, column 3. So all rows, column 3 is this one right here. And notice that these numbers that you're looking at right here, this is the proportion of area. Okay? So this forest column 3, this is the P that we want to compare to here, because this is the proportion of area occupied by each one of these types of forest land. Okay, so I'm going to store the results of this chi-square test in forest results, and I'm running a chi-square test on forest, all rows, column 1, the number of deer, and the expected proportions are found in forest, all rows, column 3. So if we call this up, now we have our chi-square test for given probabilities. And if we look back here, though, to answer this question, the first question is, what is the expected fraction of deer in the burned area according to the null hypothesis? Null hypothesis is that the deer are randomly distributed, so this would mean that the deer are distributed in this burned area according to how much of the area is actually occupied by burned forest land. So remember, we calculated this out right here. We have burned, and the proportion of area is 0.173. Okay, so that is the expected fraction of deer in the burned area, 0.173. Our second question here is asking about the chi-squared statistic for the goodness of fit test. So that chi-square statistic we see down here, chi-squared 14.463. I ask for 2 decimal places, so 14.46. The degrees of freedom, okay, here we've got 2 degrees of freedom. And then the p-value out to 4 decimal places, so we've got 0.0007. Okay, so this is our p-value. And again, finally on this one, and I wanted you to interpret these results. Okay, what can you actually say from these results here? Well, if you look at your p-value 0.0007 is quite a bit less than 0.05, which is what you were told to work with. Okay, so this means that we reject the null hypothesis that the deer are distributed randomly, and we would conclude that there are significantly more deer in the edge areas than expected by chance. Okay. The reason that this is the correct answer, if we look at the other ones here, the first, there's no evidence that deer are not randomly distributed. Well, this isn't true, because we have this chi-square test for these given probabilities, and we have a p-value for this test of less than 0.05. So that is evidence that the deer are not randomly distributed. So the first possibility is not a good choice. There are significantly less deer in the edge areas than expected by chance. Well, let's go ahead and look at that. Okay. Here I'm pulling up the expected values based on the forest results. These are the number of deer that we would expect to be in each of those types of forest. Notice that they're exactly the same numbers that we calculated up here. And if we compare these expected values to what we actually see, so here we're looking at edge areas. So edge areas, we saw 21 deer there, and we expected 10 deer there. So there are significantly less deer in the edge areas than expected by chance. Well, what you expect by chance is that there's going to be 10. What you actually see is 21. So this is not correct. Okay. But if we look at the edge areas, again, okay, the reverse is true. We do see significantly more deer in the edge areas than would be expected by chance. Okay, so this is the total of the questions here for the goodness of fit tests. So now I'm switching gears and I'm moving on to the contingency table questions. Okay, so if we look at our contingency tests for post-lab problem set, okay, so here these are the contingency tests, and we'll sort of walk through each one of these questions as well. Okay, so our contingency test, here we have data. These data are already in a nice table. but we need to get this table into R. So again, I'm going to go ahead and use this input method to get the data in, and I'm going to call my matrix tree.data, and if we call that up here, we see our table looking exactly like this one up here. Okay? Remember, you want to be careful about things like spaces, okay? Especially when you're using this input method, because it's going to interpret a space like this as a break, and that's not what you want to have happen. All right, so we want to carry out a chi-square contingency analysis of this data set using a standard alpha of 0.05. Okay, so we've got the east and the west side of the river, and we've got 4 different types of tree. So here, the null hypothesis is that the frequency of each species of tree is the same on the 2 sides of the river. This is true. Okay, question number 2. In your chi-square test, what was the expected frequency for oak trees on the east side of the river? Okay, well, as we have already entered our table here, we can now do our chi-squared test. We can call up our results. And remember, when you store those results, you can also call up your expected values. So we want to know the expected frequency of oak trees on the east side of the river. These are our expected values. Oak trees on the east side, 55.17. Okay. What is your final chi-square value for the contingency test? Give your answer to 1 decimal place. Well, here we have our chi-square value for the Pearson's chi-square test, 15.4. P-value, that's also given right here, 0.0015. Okay, answer to 4 decimal places. Okay, so what can we actually say based on these results? Okay, and in this case, I wanted you to select all that could apply. Okay, there's only one that is actually correct, though. There's a significant difference in the distribution of trees on either side of the river. Okay, this we know to be true because our p-value is less than 0.05. Okay. Here, the first choice, with there being no significant difference in the distribution of trees on either side of the river, we know this is not true because we have a p-value less than 0.05. No significant difference in the proportion of oak trees on either side of the river. Well, with this initial contingency test that we have just done, we haven't yet demonstrated whether or not there's a difference for just oak trees. Without a specific test for the species, we can't really say anything about that one way or the other. And then finally, your last choice here, there being a significant difference in the proportion of oak trees on either side of the river. Again, with the initial contingency test, we've shown that there is some sort of a difference in the distribution of trees on the 2 sides of the river, but without specific follow-up tests here, we're talking about post hoc tests, we can't really say yet whether there are different frequencies in those 2 areas. All right. Well, that was all leading us up to the next set of questions, which is to run post hoc tests for each species. Okay, so in doing that, okay, remember, if you haven't already loaded the library R companion, you're going to want to do that because R companion is what makes it nice and easy to run this line of code, the pairwise nominal independence. Okay, tree.data, this is our data. We are comparing columns. We're comparing columns because we want to compare oak to maple, oak to ash, oak to hemlock, maple to ash, maple to hemlock, and ash to hemlock. Okay. We're not looking to compare east versus west right here. We want to compare these different tree types. Okay, and as we've talked about before, we're going to set Fisher to false, G-test to false, chi-square test to true, and we do want to apply a correction method. We want to use the Bonferroni correction method. So, our question here is asking us what the Bonferroni corrected chi-square p-value for the post hoc test comparing oak trees and ash trees is. Okay, so we want the Bonferroni corrected p-value. So these p-values are your regular chi-square p-values. These are your Bonferroni corrected chi-square values. So we look up the comparison we're interested in, oak versus ash, and that value is 0.0018. Okay. Next question here, we're looking at the unadjusted p-values for maple versus ash. So maple versus ash, and we want the uncorrected values now, 0.053. Okay. Remember that all the Bonferroni correction is doing is it is multiplying the chi-square p-value that you get here by the total number of post hoc tests that you were doing. So in this case, we have 6 post hoc tests, and if you multiply each of these values by 6, you will find that it equals these values over here, the adjusted chi-square value. All right, so based on your Bonferroni adjusted chi-square post hoc tests, that's a mouthful, which species of tree differ significantly in their frequency on the two sides of the river? And I wanted you to mark all of the comparisons that showed significant results. And in this case, if we look at our Bonferroni adjusted chi-square values, we see, okay, this one is significant, this one is not less than 0.05, not less than 0.05, and these two are also not less than 0.05. So there's only one comparison, the comparison of oak versus ash, that is significant after the Bonferroni correction. Okay, so oaks versus ash trees. Okay, so that concludes the contingency tests for the post-lag problem set for week 7. And then there's just one post-lab problem set left. That post-lab problem set is the t-tests. Okay, so I'm looking for post-lab problem set for t-tests. Okay, so as you work through these R scripts, as you build your R scripts for answering these post-lab questions, you should be starting to get more and more comfortable with how to do these types of analyses. All right, so now we're set and ready to go. Clear the console just a little bit so that we can work on these t-test questions. And our first question here, I gave you an Excel sheet. And in this Excel sheet, you have some data on different worksheets, and you had to go in to the appropriate worksheet, and you needed to save the data of interest as a CSV file so that you could import that data into R. So I have created a CSV file that I'm now going to load in. So this is simply what I called my CSV file. I did not provide you with this CSV file. This is something that I generated based on this Bio 310 Week 7 post-lab data Excel sheet. Okay. So if I call up what peanuts looks like here, we have 16 peanuts, and we have their size and metric units, of course. All right, so what statistical test will you use? Well, if we look at our question here, what we want to do, we have 16 measured peanuts, and there's a claimed size of 25 millimeters, and we want to test whether or not the measured values of these 16 peanuts differs from the stated 25 millimeter claim. Okay, so that is a one sample t-test. Here I'm asking what the standard error of peanut sizes is, And you have to think about how to calculate out this standard error. And even though this isn't a standard question here that is part of running a t-test, or it's not how to run a t-test, you still have to be able to calculate these values. Okay? So here, if we look at the peanut data, okay, standard error, you know, is equal to standard deviation divided by the square root of n. So how I'm getting this here, SD of peanuts size column, because I'm referring to this right here, is in the numerator. Then in the denominator, I've got square root, and what we want to take the square root of is this, the count of this. So there's not a function called count. What we do have is a function called length, and if we ask for length of peanuts size column, it's going to give us a length of 16, and this is taking the square root of 16 then. So if we actually call that up and we ask for what that standard error is, 0.67 would be standard error to 2 decimal places. Okay, so what is the t-statistic for this test? Well, the t-statistic for this test, it's a simple one-sample t-test. So we want to run the t-test on peanuts, and our mu value is 25. Okay, so our t-statistic for this test is negative 2.62. And depending on how, sometimes you will just see this presented as absolute value. Sometimes you will see this presented with a negative sign. It doesn't really matter if it's negative or positive. It's just the direction of the difference. But I've told you here to give the absolute value. So 2.62 is what you want to enter there. All right, well, how do you interpret these findings? Okay, well, you have a significant p-value here. So that significant p-value, a p-value of less than 0.05, would cause you to reject the null hypothesis of no difference. And in rejecting the null hypothesis, you accept the alternate hypothesis that the average peanut size is different than 25. And this is a two-tailed test, but by looking at the values, and remember your one-sample t-test also spits out the mean for you. Okay, so 23.25 millimeters is the mean for the sizes of these 16 peanuts. Well, 23.25, this is less than 25, which is why this was a negative t-value for your test statistic here. So you can state that this is less than 25. Okay, so you would accept the alternate hypothesis that the average peanut size is less than 25 millimeters, and in doing so, you would reject Acme's claim because we see a significant difference from 25, and that mean is less than the 25. Okay. The next question here, we are looking at a poster in the department that shows data from a majors fair, and on that poster you have an option of becoming a chicken farmer. Okay. In this silly example, you graduate top of your class from Creighton, so you're lucky enough to be chosen for one of the top chicken farming schools, and you are taking care of 50 different hens from 2 new breeds. 30 of them are Staten Island Blues, and 20 of them are Fuzzy Foghorns. Over the course of 1 month, you count how many eggs that each chicken lays. And I've given you some summary statistics here. So X bar SIB, this is the mean number of eggs laid over 1 month by Staten Island Blues. X bar FF, this would be the mean of the Fuzzy Foghorns. And then S, remember, is standard deviation. So we have a standard deviation also for each one of these two breeds. Okay, so you're going to use these values and test the hypothesis that the two breeds differ in their average egg production. So first up, what is your null hypothesis? Well, the null hypothesis is that there's going to be no difference. Okay, so no difference between Staten Island Blues and fuzzy foghorns, but no difference in what? You have to ask yourself. Okay, well, remember that when we do these statistical tests, we are taking a sample from a population, but we are making inferences about that population. So here, we're not going to want to be looking at X bar values because these are values for the sample. What the null hypothesis states is that the population mean for Staten Island Blues is the same as the population mean for the fuzzy foghorns. Okay, that would be our null hypothesis. Okay, so this first question here, I'm asking what the pooled variance is for the samples. And you have to go back to thinking about what that equation is. All right, so from the book and from the notes here, we know that pooled variance is equal to the sum of x minus x mean squared plus y minus y mean squared divided by the sample of x plus the sample of y minus 2. Okay? And if we want to simplify this just a little bit, we can simplify it to variance of x times the sample size for x minus 1 plus the variance of y times the sample size of y minus 1 divided by the whole thing divided by. Ignore this double bracket here. What that's really meant to look like is this. Okay? All of this is going to be in the numerator, and then the denominator is the degrees of freedom. So your x sample plus your y sample minus 2. Okay? If this isn't clear already, what we're doing here is a two-sampled t-test. Okay, so I have given you some values here. These are all values that were given to you, and then our n's for the Staten Island Blues was 30, and for the Foghorn Frenzies was 20. So all of that was given to you. If we take the information that we have here, these equations for pooled variance, we can write that up using the numbers that we already know and were given here. And that's going to give us a pooled variance of 14.93. Okay? So for this question, it's all about knowing which equation to use and knowing how to enter those basic mathematical operations into R. Okay? So, the standard error of the difference of the means, okay, this equation here, standard error of the difference of the means, this is equal to the square root of pooled variance divided by sample size for group 1 or group X plus the pooled variance divided by sample size for the second group. So if again we enter our mathematical operations here, and here I'm referring to pooled.var because I have defined pooled.var as a variable up here. Okay, it's going to use this number. And we can call up SE. Okay, standard error of the difference of the means is 1.12. Okay, so here we're asking for what the t-statistic is. So to figure that out, we have to actually calculate t. And we could do this by actually running the two-sample test. But remember, all this t value requires from us is the mean of x, the mean of y, and the standard error of the difference of the means. All values that we have right here for us. So if we just do this a little bit differently, because we see the only question we're asked is for the t-statistic, we can just enter that very easily and calculate out what that t is. That t being 2.42, because I ask you to enter it with the absolute value. Okay? And for this final stretch of t-test questions here, we are looking at men in the gym lifting weights, and the observation that men lifting weights seem to try lifting more weight if there is a female onlooker. So if you collect some data on this, looking at the weights that men, these 8 men here in the question, are lifting under the 2 conditions, when a woman is and when a woman is not present. You have a worksheet in the Excel file that lists this data for you. And so what we're looking at here, this is the men lifting weights question. And this is a paired t-test. Okay. The reason that it's a paired t-test is because it's the same 8 men, and those same 8 men are tested under both conditions. Okay, when a woman is present and when a woman is not present. So, seeing as each of the men was tested under each condition, this is kind of like a before and after. Okay, so we have paired data here. So we would run a paired t-test, and we want to know what the mean difference between the 2 situations is using absolute value. All right, so the very first thing we need to do is get some data into R. So weights is my data frame, and we can call this up here. So we've got male number, there are 8 males, and then how much weight is lifted, women absent, women present. Okay. So here, if we simply run our paired t-test, okay, we're looking at weights, and we want to compare the column called women.absent, so weights, string character women.absent, weights, string character women present. Those are the 2 things that we are comparing here. And it is a paired test. If we don't say paired equals true, we do not get a paired test. This tells us the data that we were comparing. This tells us our t-value, our degrees of freedom, and our p-value for this test. Our alternative hypothesis would be that the true difference in means is not equal to 0. Our null is that there is no difference. Okay, so our alternate is that there is a difference. And we also get the mean of the differences here. Because remember, with a paired t-test, we are comparing the differences. So nicely, it spits out this value of 3.125. Okay, so giving the absolute value to 2 decimal places, 3.13. Okay, the standard error for this t-test, okay, remember that standard error is simply going to be standard deviation divided by the square root of n. Okay, so you would simply enter these numbers here into R to get your standard error value. Okay. Our t statistic, okay, is 3.28. The p-value given here is 0.014. And what can we actually conclude from this analysis? Well, we always want to assume that the order that these 2 conditions is applied is random. This would be just good experimental design. We see a significant p-value, less than 0.05, so this tells us that there is a difference between the amount of weight that men are curling in the presence versus in the absence of women. And because when we compare those means, we see that we have a higher mean value when women are present. Okay? This results in a higher mean value. We can actually compare those. So if we ask for the mean of weights, women absent, and then if we ask for the same thing, only present, we see that there's a significant value for the test. Okay, so we know there's a significant difference in women present versus women absent, and we see that women present, there's a higher mean value here. So men tend to curl more weight when a woman is present. Okay, so this concludes the walkthrough video tutorial key for week 7's post-lab assignments. If you have found this video to be helpful and illustrative, please let me know. And if they are helpful, then I will keep making these videos for you.